All right, everyone see PixInsight? I think I'm sharing it.
Yep.
Yep. All right. So I thought I'd go over just a few things real quick about light pollution gradients and just gradients in general. Up here I have some ones I created in Pixel Math. This guy over here is just the gradient that goes across. This one over here is one that goes down, and the one in the center is when you add them together. And what we find a lot when we're imaging is, depending on what part of the sky we're imaging in and where our light domes are, that we'll get a bunch of different gradients like these. This thing at the bottom is a 3D plot of the center one.
You're breaking up a little bit, Michael.
How's that?
Better.
Okay. Yeah, just give me a heads up. It seems to come and go. So here's a plot. The color is the elevation, and you can think of these gradients as kind of a plane at an angle. I don't know. I think this is the lower end, and that's the higher end, or maybe it's the other way. Now here, there's a program called Automatic Background Extractor, and it's the oldest program they have in PixInsight for handling gradients. It was useful, but it only fits a function to your data. And so, and there's no way to really control where the samples are. What you can control is the size of the samples. This is area up here. And the larger your sample, then you get a better representation of the background. But if you make them too large, then you're not going to be able to get enough samples to properly represent this slope. So I've always used around 25. The separation is how far apart those are. So I'm going to show you, it has this ability where you can have it just show the samples on an image. So I selected draw them, and all it's going to do is draw the samples. It's not going to do any removal of the gradient. Now, in PixInsight, if you take this triangle from any tool and drop it on an image, that's the same as applying it. So you can see it ran and it created a new image, and these boxes are where it is going to create samples. Now you can see it didn't get these areas. What it's doing is it tries to look around and find things that are background and not put samples on things it thinks are objects. So it basically went around the middle average value of the image and in a certain direction in each way, but then it ignored the darkest and the brightest areas. This deviation is how you control that. So if you bump that up, that makes it more permissive of samples. So if I run it again with that value, you'll see we've crept out a little bit. And this is just something where you don't want to set it too high for your data, but you have to set it high enough to get everything you know as background. So you can, anyway, you get the idea. As you increase that, you'll remove more and more of the, you'll include more and more of the samples. So I need to bump it up quite a bit for this one, and I'm just going to run it on there. So you can see after running it, it fit that slope. And if you look at this lower graph, this is a plot of that data. I did it earlier. And you can see it's flattened it out. There's no high or low areas.
On 12 meters, FTE.
Was there a question?
Sorry, guys. Just
no
a program talking.
Yeah. Yeah. So now in this case, this is known as a degree one function, which is basically a plane or a line, if you remember polynomials and all of that. In this case, we're just fitting a simple plane. Now, here's another data set I created. If you're curious, this is the equation for it. It's essentially a three-dimensional paraboloid. But this is sort of the pattern, similar to a pattern you may get, or the opposite of the pattern you would get with vignetting. But the idea is the same. And here's a 3D plot at the bottom. In this case, it's darker in the center and brighter in the corners. Now that is something Steve was asking about when you have flat fielding that doesn't quite work out. Sometimes you'll see the flat fielding works a little too well, and it'll darken the center relative to the corners when we're moving vignetting. Now, this is a second order. It's best to fit this with a second order function. And so I have a ABE set up here with that. And if I run that on this data, you'll see it flattened it. And again, this is the resulting thing. If I were to, so part of using these data sets, using these tools is understanding what type of gradient you're removing. If I set that to first order and run it, nothing happened because essentially it fit a plane through this object, which would be something, if you imagine trying to get a plane through all these data points that is equidistant, it would probably be something about this high that would be flat. A first order fit can't bend enough to represent this type of shape. So right now we're just going to worry more about linear gradients like these. If you look at your light frames, you probably, and all you have is a single source of light pollution in the sky, you'll probably see something where it's brighter on one side and darker on the other. So are there any questions so far?
Hey, Mike, I got a question.
Yeah.
Are those 3D plots something that you can do in PixInsight, or did you do those outside the program and just bring it in?
Yeah, you go script, render, 3D plot, go. You can set the position of the eye. I'm doing this on downsampled data. It's kind of slow. This is a really slow computer I'm doing it on, but anyway, you can see.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's kind of cool.
Thanks.
So here's some data I took, the NGC 4725, and these are at different times during the night, different filters, but the important thing is you can see, well, they're noisy, but you can see in this case, this corner is brighter than that corner. This corner is brighter than that one, and so on. Now, all of these I've run ABE on with first order, and you can see, I'm just redoing the application. You can see it is pretty much taking care of that linear gradient. Now, it's an advanced technique, but some people, and I've had to do this occasionally, you take your calibrated frames and you actually run ABE on each one. There's a way to batch process that. So when you stack, you're stacking this instead of stacking these images. Now, as I showed before, when you take gradients in different directions and you add them, your resulting gradient may or may not be linear. Probably not. It's going to be a really ugly surface, and then ABE is not going to be able to handle it anymore. So if we go now to this data set that I put out, this NGC 4725L for DBE, if I run ABE on that one with a linear degree, you'll see it does all right. But we've got this, let me get sorry. To really look at light pollution like this and handling it, you really need to get in and stretch the data pretty savagely. So now you can start to see. We've got some weirdness here, which I don't think is real. This arm, and maybe some of this out here, is actually maybe an extension of the galaxy. But you can see some darkness here and brightness here, and we've got this whole ridge along the bottom that's a little odd. Those are probably more from flat fielding. The other thing is, I've stretched this really hard. If I did just a normal stretch, it doesn't. And then I darken the background a little. You can see it's not too bad, but you can see some of this stuff. So I do want to clean it up. A common thing you'll see when people don't use flats is they end up with images that look like this. And that's their way, that they haven't used any light pollution. They're just trying to hide, their background. So by cleaning all this up, we can actually, extend the amount of actual data, because there's a lot of stuff from the galaxy that would be nice to show here. So let me get this stretched again. So what I did in that case was I ran ABE. I set the degree to 1. It defaults to 4, and I'll show you what happens there. 4 gives you a large degree of flexibility in the fit, but that also is a large degree of ability of that fit to go completely bonkers. So in this case, it may work okay, but I've seen it do some really bad things. So you can see it looks like, we got this ridge here that wasn't there necessarily before, and that's probably the fit just not able to do things. So by setting the degree to 1, we're limiting it to just taking out sort of a linear plane gradient. It can't really get out of control too much. Down here, the defaults are to be none. So you have to choose between subtraction and division. And if you read about this, there's a lot of discussion. Generally, I think the consensus is if you're taking away light pollution, which is additive light to the image, you want to do a subtraction at this point. If you're cleaning up flat fielding, where a flat fielding operation is you're just dividing your image by the flat, people tend to go more with using division to clean up flat fielding issues. But if you do some experimenting with both, you'll see they give similar results. But I tend to do subtraction when removing light pollution. These buttons are usually off. So what do? We're going to subtract the light pollution from the image. This normalize button means after it's done that subtraction, it'll add a constant to the image to get the median of the entire image back to where it was before. And I generally do that. If you don't click this and you run it, it'll create a new image that shows you the background, which can be handy. And this just says replace the target image. So I'm going to show you the background it fit. And it's usually useful to look at that just to make sure. All right, so basically brighter in that corner, darker in this corner. If we go back to this data, that's consistent with what we're seeing. So it seems to have done the correct thing. So generally I'll run ABE at the beginning, and that gets rid of any gross sort of gradient across the image. And I'll use these settings here. After I do that, it's time to run DBE. So let's see, if everyone has this data set, is anyone going to follow along with their own PixInsight? If not, I won't go through every detail, but if you wanted to, we could, ask questions. So I would say run ABE with these settings. Then we need to run DBE. Oh. It's a considerably more complex program.
It's like Michael Mantini's trying to get my attention for a
Oh, yes.
So Michael, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Or do I have to unmute?
Hey, Michael, quick question. Wanted to get your opinion. I've read from a few people that they precede what you're doing now with background neutralization. Is there an advantage, in your opinion, to doing that as just kind of a first step before going into?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see people do it both ways. Now, what that's doing, background neutralization, is when you want to get, here we go. So, right, so if you had like a color image and you run this, it's going to measure each channel, red, green, blue, determine the background level, and then shift them all additively or subtracting so they're all the same. So you don't have a color cast.
Okay.
Right. So basically it's just doing it adding or subtracting. Now, if you run this before, if you have an extreme gradient like I was showing here, and you run it before, then when it looks at the entire background, you know, probably in this case, these high values will offset the low values, and you might get about the right answer. Like if I run statistics on this image right now, let's see. All right, so the median is 0.014. Now, if I take out the gradient, it didn't shift very much, right? Hardly any at all. So that would be my only concern, is if you had a very extreme gradient that confused background neutralization before you'd cleaned up the background. I would generally do it after.
Okay.
Because, you know, but probably not going to make a big difference unless you have some really bizarre light pollution.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so I'm going to close this guy. Let's put him up here and make this guy. All right. So with DBE, as you see, when it comes up, it's all desensitized. You can't do anything because it wants you to click on the image you're going to work on. So just click near the center, and now we've set it up. This cross here is used for symmetry operations that most people never use, so I wouldn't worry about it. But it just indicates DBE is going to work on that image. So in DBE, you can either go around and click on the image to add points, which could get old after a while, or you can use this section right here called sample generation. And here are the defaults. Again, I'll usually bump that up to 25 for the sample radius. That's how much each sample is looking at of the background before it determines the background level there. The samples per row. Now, let's say we just set that to something. Let's use the default. You hit this generate button. All right, so it's complaining that it didn't create any samples. Now, this is similar to the problem before. There is so much shape in this background. It's not flat at all. It's got this ridge that's getting to be almost as bright as part of this arm. So when the tool looked at the image, it's basically going, I can't really determine a background because there's so much happening. In DBE, the parameter here is called tolerance. The smaller this value, the more picky it is. If we bump this up to say 1 and hit generate again, then you'll see, except for this area where it got the darkest, these points are way off from the typical value of the background. It put a data point. If I didn't like that size and I wanted to make them larger, I could hit Resize All and it would just resize the existing points. And that's good if you want to play around with different sizes to see if that makes any effect. So I use this tolerance in order to make it permit these points to come on. There's another parameter here called shadows relaxation. That's basically how far off from the typical point into the dark side will we go. So if I bump that up to 5 and hit generate again. Now, anytime you hit generate, it will destroy anything you've done. So just be aware of that. In terms of points, like if I added points manually and then you hit generate. There we go. It got rid of those, but you can see because I increased the degree that it allows darker samples from 3 to 5, I pulled in these points along the edge. So it tries not to put, like, for example, it would not put a sample there by default because it's in the middle of a star. But because these stars have halos, generally I would go around and all you do is you click on a point and you can pull it off if you don't like where it is.
Hey, Michael,
yeah.
Could you do a quick explanation of the shadows relaxation again? I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, let me go back. So the default, okay, you can always look at the tooltip, but basically tolerance effect, like if I set tolerance really low, like 0.2, I think that's standard deviations, but basically it's saying that, you know, it's going to either take a median or do something of the entire image and then start looking in these little boxes. And if the value in that box is close enough to sort of the overall sense of the background it has, it'll allow it. If it put a box here, that value is so far away from the typical background value, it rejects it. Now, how tightly it enforces that is affected by this value. If you set it small, now you see they all turned red. That means they're not valid samples, and it rejected them. If I bump it up to, say, 0.75, we're being more permissive. Now, what these numbers mean, I don't know. I've determined these by just doing this for a long time, what kind of values work. That seemed to do okay, except down here, right? These samples, they were not too bright. They tended to be darker than what it was thinking. Now you could just keep increasing the tolerance, but that also is going to allow more samples on the bright side, and you might start getting samples into these areas.
Okay.
So so there's an additional knob you can tweak, which is how far on the dark side can you go? And so if you increase this one, it allows more of the pixels darker than typical. So I went to 5, and that pulled in some of these. Go to 6. All right, so that allowed me to get these. Now, typically you may not see those problems. This weird dark ridge at the bottom is something I see in my flat building. You may not have that occur, but these two are the main controls on the sample generation. You can also, this one, you can change this value. If you lower it, each pixel gets a weight. If I click on a sample, let me just put a sample on a star. All right, so this is showing the black pixels are the ones it considers too far away from being a background pixel. And so in this case, a good fraction of this entire box, this square represents all the pixels in this sample. So if I move it on top of like a star, right, you can see there's very few valid pixels. So this parameter controls how many valid pixels you need per sample to be allowed. But generally, I will just adjust these two. This last one is how hard it tries to fit a surface through all these points. Generally, the default is fine. I wouldn't recommend playing with that at this point. So what we've got now is we generated the samples. I did 10 per row. I increased the tolerance and the shadows relaxation so it would put samples all across the entire image. I'm not going to, usually I would go in here and maybe slide these away from the galaxy, but let's not get too pedantic. Okay, so again, like ABE, you have a selection. You can subtract or divide. I'm going to do subtraction. That's generally the only mode I've used it in, except for a few occasions. I'm going to normalize. I don't need to see the background, and I want to replace the target image. Now, what the operation I tend to do now is I will duplicate the original image here. So in PixInsight, you right-click, and you hit duplicate. So this is just a copy of this image, but I like to do this because, first of all, it doesn't have all these points all over it, and I can just drag DBE onto it, and it'll run, while it's leaving the original data like it was. Now, it may have been subtle. I'll undo and redo this. You can see it sort of cleaned up this bottom a little bit. It's brighter than it was. And in this area. So it worked on it, but we still have this ridge here, and we have this odd thing here. So at this point, I would, now, if you're not familiar with process icons, I'm going to use them a lot, so this is a good time to sort of get familiar. Everything I've done in this tool, imagine a program where you would do all this work, and then if you wanted to do it again, you had to enter all these values and remember what you did. That would kind of suck, right? So PixInsight added the ability, if I drag off that corner, and instead of dropping it on the image where it would apply it, if I drop it on this background area, it creates what's called a process icon. Now, if you look at it, it is probably not something you want to mess with, but basically all these numbers are where all those points were. These are all the settings. This is just an XML file. You don't ever have to look. I'm just letting you know, this is what is in stored. Is encapsulated in there is all these settings. So now I can close this. And I typically would rename this. Somebody called it a DBE 1 because it was the first DBE I ran. If I hit launch on there, it'll come right back up. Except now it's applying all of that to this image. That is, remember, this is the first cleaned image we did. So now I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm going to start with the image that was the output of the previous step, using the DBE from the previous step. But now I've got to do something else. The problem here is you can see these points for the samples are spaced pretty far apart. So it's going to have a data point here and a data point here, and then it's going to fit a surface between these points. Well, there's a lot happening in between them, right? This is kind of ramping up and then going back down if you were to go across with a cut in this direction. So one thing you could do is you could put in a really high number here and increase the number of samples, or what I generally do is just kind of go nuts and just put a lot of samples in the regions of the image that seem to have the most shape to them. Now, why am I doing this? Because I want it to try to fit through all these points and capture this ridge down here. Now, you won't see many things online talking about doing this, so it may be a bit unconventional, but this is why you want to be able to save your settings, because I don't want to have, I'm going to do this like 3 or 4 times. There's no way I want to have to enter all this again. Now, I don't know any way to hide the samples while you're doing this, so it's hard. I'm going to duplicate this. What I'm trying to do is everything in this area, I'm just going to put a lot of samples on, because as you can see, there's obviously a ridge. The values go up along here. The rest of it, there's a few areas that are brighter, but now remember, this thing's stretched like crazy. So you're going to see imperfections, but this is the main area that I want to affect. So I'm going to just put samples along here. And I'm just doing that by clicking repeatedly. I don't know a way to automate this. Well, I do, but you'd have to write a Python script. But that's usually what I do. But let's just do it this way. It's not too bad. We don't have to do it once. All right, let's take that. Now, before you lose anything, I'm going to drag that off and save this guy and call that DBE2. Now, did I duplicate this already? I guess I didn't. I'm going to duplicate it again because I want to have one to run the next stage on. Oh, that was it.
Michael,
Yes,
question.
sure.
How do we know, looking at this picture, that what you're trying to erase is not valid, say dust or something like that, that really would enhance the picture?
Well, that's the trick, isn't it? You don't always know. There's a bit of judgment. Now, if you can find someone who sat on this a while and took a deeper image on AstroBin, you might be able to get some hints. But like this, the Able 31 I was working on, there weren't many images that pulled out the outer halo, so it was a similar intensity to some of these features. So it's a disclaimer, I'm not recycling my data, but you know, there is some level of discretion. It's similar to doing wavelets on planetary and lunar images. You presume that what you're bringing out by that enhancement are actual features and not sharpening, you know, defects in the camera or something. You know, you have to. But in this case, it's a rather odd ridge here. Now, this part you could argue might be some structure, but for something to have just been perfectly aligned along the edge at this distance, seems a little contrived, but you don't really know. So I usually just look for deeper images than mine. But I mean, how would you know otherwise, right? Unless, well, yeah, I don't know. If you could go to a darker site and take the images again, that might help. The problem here is when you have light pollution, remember, the light pollution, the amount of light in my original image here from light pollution is probably greater or similar to the light coming from the object. And what we're ending up with is we're going to subtract off that light and then look at the object. But that's kind of like if you had a beer and, it was half beer and half froth, and you're interested in what that in the froth, but you got all that beer below it that you got to subtract off. It tends to, then when you stretch what's remaining, you tend to accentuate any defects. If you shot this from a place with no light pollution, first of all, you wouldn't have the extra noise, but also you wouldn't be trying to fit the light pollution and remove it. And all the defects that introduces because your fit may not be proper. This may have been just because my fit, when it came through this area, it wasn't proper and it created additional problems. So I'll try to be concise. You really don't know unless you can find a really good image to reference. Yeah, I've struggled with that. At least in this image, I think most of it is this galaxy. There's some little galaxies here and this big guy in his arm. If this were, for example, a really rich nebular area in Cygnus, you may not have any points that aren't nebulosity in the entire image. And that's where it really becomes challenging to remove the gradient. Fortunately, you're usually taking those images with narrowband filters that aren't affected by this as much. But all right, so let me review where I was. I've run DBE once. I took the output of that and I run DBE on it again, and I added a bunch of points to have it better represent an area where I see some discrepancy. I'm trying to pick up a little more of the background so that that'll anchor the fit a little better. All right, so this is a copy of that image that I'm going to apply it to. Now, hopefully that'll, in that lower area, clean up the, this computer's slow. All right, let's see what we did. So you can see it did tame it. That's before, that's after. I did add some points, so I'm going to make a new DBE too. So we're going to get rid of this one. And we're going to do it again. So we're done with that. This is going to be our new image. And you can see this was a clone. So you launch this on the last one you ran it on. And you duplicate that fellow. And at this point, I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to have it try the same operation again and see if we can clean up this area a little more. All right, so here's before. There's after. It's subtle, but we're getting there. So I'm going to do it one more time. So because I use this, I'm just going to save this one more time. I'm using the same one over and over. You don't have to keep saving it, but I'm going to just do it one more time. So it's, oh, how do I go back? Let's see, DBE 3. So again, I'm going to launch it on the output from the last step, duplicate that step, and run it again. Once you kind of get used to this, it's not too difficult. All right, let's see if we did anything with that one. All right, it's getting to be pretty subtle. So we'll stop there. Now, like I said, I've stretched this image a lot. If we go back and stretch it more like you might if you're processing it, you'll see I'll go back to the original if I can find it. Let's see. All right, and I think I might be able to use these settings on there. Right. So what you can see is in these areas, even at this stretch level, we've cleaned up some of this glow. I would probably actually stretch it a little more if I were processing it to more of that level. And I would probably still do a few DBE steps, but the idea is, you know, this kind of area here, we've cleaned up. And so the idea here to remember is just you can run DBE multiple times and you don't have to redo your settings. Just every time you do it, you know, whatever you add some points, just remember, take the blue triangle and drag it off and then give it a name. And then, now I do this for multiple reasons. You know, sometimes when I'm processing data, it might be over several days. I don't get it all done at once. I'll save the settings I used, so when I come back and look at it, I can go, how much noise reduction did I use here? You can save these. If I selected all of those and then said save selected icons, you know, I could just put in, you know.
Another question from Michael Mantine.
Yep. You could save them as a name and then come back later, and under process icons, you can say merge. That'll load them in addition to the ones you have. So it's really useful. Yeah, Michael.
Hey, Michael, very interesting approach. I was wondering, could your technique that you're using here, could that address amp glow
Yeah.
to a degree?
Yeah, let's see here. How much data on here? Let's try to think of. Yeah, you could certainly. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an easy way to. Let's see here. I can. No. If I have any. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, let's take one of these. All right, so here's a 120-second dark. I'm trying to stretch it to show the amp glow. This is from an ASI 1600, and oh, having trouble with this guy. Right, so there's the amp glow. Part of the problem is this. We could try it. It might be a little noisy because it's a single. I mean, this is a master, but you know, if we consider this a light frame, pretend like there's a galaxy in the middle. Here's our amp glow from that process. Again, you would probably want to. Now here I might use. Yeah, I'd probably use 25. Let's see if we can get some points. No. All right, so I'm going to boost this up. And try it again. All right, so we're going to go up even more. I'm not worried about capturing any objects or anything here. All right, so you can change these sample points. I haven't done it on this computer, but sometimes they get blended in when you stretch things. But you can see there's points most everywhere, but it's not happy in the area we're most interested in. So let me bump that up a little more. Nope. So I haven't generally dealt with something. There we go. All right. So now you can see this area is pretty smooth. Imagine this is the highest point and it's kind of sloping down to the center. The distance that it slopes over is comparable to the distance between these points. So you'd have to come in here and give it some more points to fit, obviously, or it's just going to completely gloss over that feature. So what I'll do is I'll do this one and I won't do the other one. And you can kind of get an idea if it's doing anything. Oh, I didn't turn off the background. All right. So that is the background it fit. So I forgot to turn these things on. Sorry. All right, we'll try it again. So, you know, it's sort of maybe, now you can see here kind of overcorrected, but here where I gave it more points, it tried to smooth it out. So, you know, it might be viable. I mean, I would always recommend taking darks, but that's the way you do it. So the thing here is just, you know, these areas where things are, when I say things aren't changing very quickly, you know, you imagine this is a hill where black pixels are the lowest, then this is a bit of a slope, but it's kind of a gentle slope over half the image. Here, clearly, it just ramps up from the bottom to the top and higher than anywhere over here in, you know, an eighth of the image or less. So you need to throw more points there. You could throw points over the entire image. It's just going to run slower because it's going to have to fit all of those points. So I don't know if anyone's ever done any kind of code where you have like adaptive meshes or anything where you allocate more points in the areas where things change more quickly. But that's kind of the idea here. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't care whether it's a light frame or what kind of frame it is because it's just basically fitting a surface.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Trying to think, there's really not much more, you know, I've ever had to do. It's basically, you know, generating those points automatically, adjusting the thresholds until it allows them, adding in points, and then let me just show them one more time. So, you know, if I were to set this threshold too high, let's say, and then hit generate, you know, it started to put some points in here. It put one on top of a star. Those are kind of giveaways that your threshold's getting too large. Now, in this case, you know, it wouldn't be so bad. I would probably just come in and just right click and move these out. And generally, you know, you would want, this sort of is the perimeter I would avoid because I don't really know. I don't know if this is real or not. So I'd probably just leave it behind for now. So this kind of area, you would not want to add points in here because if you, it shouldn't use them. But if you did do that, let's say, and I'll get rid of the discard. And so we'll see what the background looks like. You're going to see that it incorporated some of that into what it thought was light pollution. And it would subtract this away, which would actually be subtracting some light from our galaxy, and you'll get this effect. So that's, and also the star. So that's another giveaway that you've, you know, you've included points you don't want.
Quick question.
All right, that's pretty much just, I wanted to show a few successive iterations of DBE and how to put points on it. But I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I got a quick question. Do you ever, when you're doing the DBE runs, do you ever run the screen transfer function and stretch it and see what's going on there, and then, you know, turn it back off and do you know, to kind of see what it's doing, or do you just do it with it at that same stretch you started with?
Right. So that's part of the reason I also clone it is that, you know, I can play with this one without affecting the stretch I had on the original, the DBE that's in process back here, right? So that, I find that handy because then I can work on this, and yeah, I'll go back to what might be a more normal stretch, or even, sometimes I'll just, I like running mass stretch on things. With the defaults, it tends to, what it does is it tries to stretch things that aren't stars and bright like stars. So here I removed the DBE completely. I mean the auto stretch, and that's the output of just a mass stretch. Is this, right? And so you can play with that a little. Now this was, I didn't grab the right one. This is not the final product. You can see it still has some stuff that I removed later, but again, you know, you just, if you can clean up this kind of stuff, then you can leave in some nice things like these arms. If you couldn't get rid of that stuff, you probably need to back off how bright you stretch that part. You can still see some of it, but you do compromise a little. You know, you can still get a pretty good image out of it, but yeah, if you can clean up those things. Trying to think, I don't know if I have an image of something which just obviously didn't flat field correctly. I guess I could load a, all right, so let's say we had this is just a flat. Right, so this is a flat image. You can see the dust and everything on it, right? Now, let's see. There we go. All right, so I inverted it. So we'll pretend like we tried to clean up the vignetting, but our flats didn't quite work and our background looks like that. Let me close this guy. All right, so you could try running DBE on this to clean up your image, clean up that background. So you click on the image and we'll just try to default generate some points. All right, so there, I used this to, sorry, this computer's slow. You can see we didn't get points very much, very far. So I'm probably gonna have to boost this guy a bit. And maybe this guy a bit. All right, so that's better. Still not some in the corners here. So if I manually add them, I'm not sure if it'll use them, but let's just try that. Let's see, did I get one up there? All right, so we'll duplicate this. And in this case, I'm going to use division just to do something different. Now, this would be a case if your flats don't work, hopefully it's never this bad, but generally when flats don't work, your center will tend to be darker than the corners. If in the original unflattened frame, the center was brighter than the corners, which is what vignetting does. Yeah, so we'll just run that on him. All right, so you can see, yeah, you know, we did a pretty good job flattening out the background areas, right? The pulled the center in and pulled the corners down. So that would be how you would run it on an image that you didn't clean up the light pollution. Now, in this case, it's symmetric. I mean, meaning this looks pretty similar in each quadrant. If for some reason this was shifted off to the side, probably would still work. But if you had this pattern, and let's say you had like a lot of stuff going on over here, that was like a nebula or something, and you couldn't put samples there. I've only done this once, but you can turn on what's called axial symmetry, and yeah, let's set the higher order. What it will do here is take all the points in a certain area and then rotate it around to the other parts. So assuming everything's radially symmetric like this is, you can do that, but I've rarely had to do that. So again, all these things are things you hope to never have to do. If you have good calibration frames, these things don't tend to come up, at least not as bad as this example. But if you know, can't get the frames after the fact and you want to try to save an image, it certainly will do a good job. So that's all I had about DBE that I can think of, but if there's questions, of course, I'll try.
Got a question
I
as
got a
well?
question, Mike.
Yeah.
If you do this on an RGB, like do you do this on each of the subframes separately, your master separately, or if you do it on if you do it on a combined RGB and you had a gradient going one way in red and a different way in green, would it treat them separately?
It treats each plane individually, but I can show you that if you want to do something goofy. Let's see here. So let's.
Do you typically wait until you've combined them all to do it, or do you do it on the same?
Yeah. Well, no, I generally do it earlier.
Okay.
I would do it and then do background neutralization and then do photometric color calibration. All right, so let's call you G. And call you.
Losing your audio.
Sorry, how's that?
Yep, better.
Sorry, I'm holding the mic because I don't have a good weight, so I'm trying to do this with one hand. All right, so there's our crazy image. Yeah. This is showing all the blue, I mean green, and then the blue. And you can see in this case, I use the flattened versions of red and blue. They're both flat, but the one that has something going on. So in theory, if we run DBE on this, it's going to run it on. Clean it up. I'm going to
Audio's
not a
breaking up
color.
again.
Oh gosh, I hope it's not the computer. Everything good?
Yeah, it's better. I don't know if it's when you're holding the mic farther away from your mouth that it's breaking up, but
I've noticed problems when I'm doing operations, but is this good right now?
yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
All right, I'll repeat. So I created a synthetic image. Two of the R and the B channels are just a flat image, and the G is my vignetted image. So that's why it has this odd appearance. It's purple out in the corners and green in the center, because that's where the gradient in the green channel peaks. Just gonna do the same thing here real quick. I'm gonna bump up the tolerance so it'll create all the samples I want. Oh, yep. So we're gonna generate our samples, and I'm gonna have it actually, I'm gonna do division. I'm gonna have it show us the background it generates, so you can see it in each color plane. So you're going to see it's going to run it on channel 1, which is red, channel 0, channel 1, which is green, and channel 2, which is blue. All right, so this is the resulting image, which is now gray. This is the background it fit, which was, so you can see it did each channel individually. In the red, it pretty much didn't do much. There was a slight depression in the center here. The green had all the fun action because it had this odd gradient in it. And then the blue also, like the red, was just a little dimmer in the center. So it fit that background in each channel and then subtracted it from each channel. We were left with just a gray image. Should be.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, there's a
Thanks.
little bit of offset in the green. That's what background neutralization is for, right? You take this guy and run it on there. Oop, but it's not that high enough. Should neutralize it. It's trying, but I've got to stretch really hard. Wow, I could sell that for $1 million at an art museum. But anyway, so that it runs on each one, so you don't have to do it. But I usually do it individually because I can see, it's just easier for me to understand what's happening. If I look at, imagine this was a stacked LRGB, and then I just run it on each one individually, and then I end up with, an LRGBs that are in pretty good shape. Then if I do the next step, I'm making it a little easier. I probably have to run DBE afterwards anyway, because the remaining gradients in R, G, and B are probably not in the same directions, because I took that data in different parts of the sky. But you know, it's kind of my workflow, but you know, everyone kind of finds the workflow they like. The things to look out for is in all these cases, we're either subtracting or adding something to the image. And generally, you know, the order of those won't matter. Whereas if you think about things like division, the order you do divisions do tend to matter. You know, 1 divided by 2 divided by 4 is not 2 divided by 1 divided, right? You get weird things. So at this early stage, things like DBE and background neutralization are just subtracting or adding numbers, and are kind of intermixable. But after you stretch and you do an LRG combination, right, then I should mention that generally you don't try to do light pollution correction after you've stretched or done an LRG combine where you combine stretched images. Generally, it occurs very early in your workflow after you've stacked the images, but before you combine color and do calibration and all that. That's generally where people handle it. And before you would do any noise reduction or anything else.
Got a question from Arjun.
Yeah, Arjun.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think it was really useful. So I was trying to do it to shadow on my computer, and I actually noticed that you know, the more DBEs I did, at some point, you know, the darker thing at the bottom could actually flip, so it starts to become like
right.
brighter. So
yeah.
You know, you need to be careful there, right? So it's all like, you know, there's nothing automatic here.
No.
Which is fine. I don't think that's a big issue. But more interestingly, I think you said something that you were running ABE on the individual frames before you even stack or integrate them.
Right.
So is that what you've done to get to this image?
Right. So the idea there is there's something called an image container in PixInsight.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is basically what it says. So you click on this and you can add frames. So let's say you pick your frames, and then this thing will show a list of frames. And then you set up where you want the output stuff to go. Then you would make a process icon, and you can find this stuff online. If you want some help with it, I won't go through the whole detail, but now this is where I get confused. I think you drop this. I think you minimize this. It's not at all obvious. You do it this way. No, you do it this way. You do it that way. There basically, you create an image container that has the images you want to run a process on. You create a process icon. Let me just throw an image in there. All right, so I got one image. No. I don't remember. I always have to look it up. But the idea is you would, let's say it worked this way. You put all your, let's say you calibrated all your light frames. You created an ABE that you ran on one of them that showed it removed the gradient properly as a test. Then you would take that, and again, I can't remember the process, but in theory, you would drag it on top of this container, and that would trigger the container running that process icon in a batch way on every single frame, and then writing it out in whatever directory you told it to. And then you would end up with a directory full of your calibrated frames that had ABE run on them. What I can do is I can go online and find a tutorial on how to use an image container and put that on the imaging list, and then that. But that's the general idea, and it kind of takes a while, but it will.
No, I think you can find it. It's just a really it's one big takeaway, because you know, you see the images, right? You know, you have a street light, right? And overnight the scope just starts hitting the street light, So this gradient is just shifting over time.
Oh.
If you just look at the final stacked image, right? Yeah, there's a gradient in it, but that gradient is not consistent, right? It's moved. So I think it's really interesting to run it over the individual frames. So you can kind of get rid of the delta over the couple hours that you're sequencing. That's cool.
Right. It may have been that you had a linear gradient at an instant, but if you imagine a vector pointing along this hill, it would kind of rotate as you moved relative to the sky or your light source. And if you add all of those together, you're going to get something that's not a nice, simple thing anymore. And DBE can try to fit that. But yeah, if you could just clean up most of it before you stack, you make your work later much easier. Now, unfortunately, DBE does not work with this image container. So that's why I'm using ABE. They're supposed to be working on a DBE replacement. It's been years now, but hopefully they're getting closer. And I believe that would be one of the things is they want to incorporate that idea in the earlier stages. There is another thing, if you're really motivated, that you could look at. There's something called local normalization, which we're getting a bit off the beaten path here. But what this does is you give it a reference image, which ideally would be an image without any light pollution of your object, which in theory could be your stacked image after you cleaned it up the best you could in DBE. And then it will run on all of your frames you give it, and we'll try to make those frames look like your reference in the background areas. That's what this background limit and all this crap's for here, so it won't touch anything else. I use that on my Able 31 and to clean up some problems. It is a really powerful tool, but as you saw with your DBE, at some point it might get a little out of control. This guy can do it as well, but local normalization might be worth looking at, because if you're saying that some of your frames just show an okay gradient, and then if you get in a certain part of the sky, you have another light source contributing. If you used the part of the sky where you don't have that contamination as a reference, you may be able to clean it up in those later frames. Not promising any magic, but that's the idea at least. So that's another tool you might want to investigate. And if you have questions, hit me up with an email and I might be able to help.
Cool, thank you.
All right, we're doing pretty good questions. I appreciate all the feedback and everyone contributing. Anything else?
Don't see any other questions. Anybody have a question? Drop it in chat. Looks all good, Michael.
All right. Well, again, I appreciate everyone showing up. It was just fun to play around with this stuff. Always just hit me up with an email if you have a question or you have something you want me to look at. So yeah, I'll try to give it a look. Just put it on Google Drive or something.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael.
Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for doing it.
All right.
Thanks, Michael.
See you Thursday.
All right, thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Yeah.